Picture two aircraft, built by two sanctioned, ambitious nations, both designed for the exact same reason to break a decades-old duopoly and finally give a major world power a genuine independent domestic alternative to the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320. Both were announced with enormous fanfare. Both were supposed to be flying commercial passengers by the mid-2010s. Both ended up years behind schedule. Tangled in supply chain crises, engine problems, and geopolitical sanctions, nobody fully anticipated when either program actually launched. One of them, China's C919, is now flying real passengers on real commercial routes. Slowly, painfully, but actually doing it. The other, Russia's MC-21, still hasn't carried a single paying customer anywhere, even after 19 years of development. So which one, if either, actually stands a real chance of reaching genuine industrial scale, competing meaningfully against Boeing and Airbus, rather than simply existing as a nationalist prestige project propped up by captive domestic orders? The answer turns out to be considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting than a simple head-to-head comparison might suggest, because both programs are failing to hit their own targets in remarkably similar ways, for remarkably similar reasons, even while sitting at genuinely different points on the runway toward actual commercial viability. Let's start with China's C919, since it has the longer track record of actual tangible results to examine. The program traces back to 2008, when China formally established the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China, universally known as COMAC, with an explicit national mandate to build large commercial aircraft domestically and reduce the country's total dependence on Boeing and Airbus. Production officially began in December 2011. The first prototype rolled out in November 2015. The aircraft's maiden flight, originally targeted for 2014, didn't actually happen until May 5th, 2017. Full type certification from China's own aviation regulator, the Civil Aviation Administration of China, didn't arrive until September 29th, 2022, a full 8 years behind the program's original schedule. The first production aircraft was delivered to China Eastern Airlines that December, and the C919 finally entered genuine commercial passenger service on May 28th, 2023, nearly 15 years after COMAC itself was founded. On paper, that's a genuine, real achievement, an aircraft that actually exists, actually flies, and actually carries paying passengers today. But here's where the story gets considerably messier and considerably more revealing about the actual gap between announcing an achievement and genuinely scaling one. Despite entering service back in 2023, the C919's production ramp-up has been consistently, repeatedly disastrous compared to COMAC's own stated targets. Going into 2025, COMAC set an ambitious goal of delivering 75 C919 aircraft over the course of the year, roughly one every 5 days, a pace that would have finally signaled the program was transitioning from a symbolic achievement into a genuine industrial operation. That target didn't survive contact with reality for very long. By September 2025, Bloomberg reported the company had quietly slashed its own target down to just 25 aircraft for the entire year, and even that dramatically reduced goal proved wildly optimistic. Regulatory filings from China's own three major state airlines, China Eastern, Air China, and China Southern, revealed that, as of September 2025, only 5 aircraft had actually been delivered against an expected 32 for that point in the year. When the final numbers came in, COMAC had delivered somewhere between 15 and 16 C919 aircraft for all of 2025, essentially identical to its 2024 delivery total, meaning an entire year had passed with functionally zero meaningful acceleration in production, despite 2 full years of supposedly ramping up manufacturing capacity. The picture got even more discouraging heading into 2026. Data compiled by Air Data News showed COMAC delivered 0 C919 aircraft in January 2026, 1 in February, 2 in March, and 2 in April, a grand total of just 5 aircraft in the first 4 months of the year, a pace that, if sustained for the full year, would land somewhere around 15 aircraft total, essentially flat with the previous 2 years, rather than showing any genuine acceleration whatsoever. Since entering commercial service in May 2023, the C919 had reached a cumulative total of just 37 deliveries by the spring of 2026, spread across China Eastern with 15 aircraft, Air China with 11, China Southern with 10, and 1 additional aircraft still held by COMAC itself for demonstration purposes. Industry analysts examining the underlying causes pointed to a familiar combination of problems. The aircraft still depends heavily on Western suppliers for its most critical systems, most importantly the CFM LEAP-1C engines built through the joint venture between America's GE Aerospace and France's Safran, along with Western-sourced avionics, a dependency that turned genuinely dangerous in the summer of 2025, when the United States temporarily halted exports of those exact engines amid rising trade tensions before the block was eventually lifted. Beyond the engine vulnerability, reporting from the South China Morning Post specifically cited ongoing labor shortages and the sheer underlying complexity of aircraft manufacturing as continuing bottlenecks, with analysts noting that some fully completed. Airframes were reportedly sitting finished, but simply waiting for engines to actually arrive before they could be delivered. The order book paints its own complicated picture of exactly how far the C919 actually is from genuine international commercial viability. COMAC entered 2026 with a backlog exceeding 1,000 total aircraft across its full product lineup, a number that sounds genuinely impressive in isolation. But a closer look at that backlog reveals something considerably less encouraging for anyone hoping the C919 might soon compete head-to-head with Boeing and Airbus on the open global market. Independent analysis from Liam News found that more than 1,000 placed orders gave the C919 specifically only around a 7% share of the entire 125 to 240 seat single-aisle aircraft market's global backlog. And critically, nearly every single one of those orders came from Chinese state-owned airlines and leasing companies operating under what amounts to direct government direction, rather than from independent commercial airlines around the world making free market purchasing decisions based on the aircraft's actual merits. As of early 2026, the C919 had still not delivered a single unit to any airline outside mainland China, with its only international orders coming from carriers in Brunei and Cambodia, both close political allies of Beijing rather than genuinely independent commercial customers shopping competitively among Boeing, Airbus, and COMAC. The aircraft also still lacks certification from either the American Federal Aviation Administration or Europe's Aviation Safety Agency, the two regulatory approvals that would actually be required before most international airlines outside China's own sphere of influence could seriously consider operating it at all. Before diving deeper into the production numbers, it's worth pausing on how these two aircraft actually compare on paper, since the underlying engineering ambitions behind each program reveal a lot about their respective design philosophies. The C919 seats between 158 and 192 passengers depending on configuration, with a range of roughly 4,075 to 5,555 kilometers, putting it in fairly direct competition with the standard Boeing 737 MAX 8 and Airbus A320neo. The MC-21-310, the primary variant Russia has focused on, is designed to carry a broadly similar passenger load, and Russian engineers have specifically marketed the aircraft's wider fuselage cross-section, a genuine, credible technical advantage over both the 737 and the C919, as a meaningful selling point, since a wider cabin allows for more comfortable seating and wider aisles without sacrificing capacity. On paper, that wider body design gives the MC-21 a real, legitimate engineering edge, precisely the kind of differentiator that might eventually help it compete on customer experience, even if it struggles to match Boeing and Airbus on raw production volume. But a wider fuselage means nothing to an airline that can't actually take delivery of the aircraft. That fundamental gap, genuine engineering merit sitting idle behind a certification process, still years from completion, defines the MC-21's entire current predicament far more than any design shortcoming does, but which sits at a dramatically earlier stage of actual commercial reality. The MC-21 was launched in 2007 under what was then called the Irkut Corporation, later folded into the state-run United Aircraft Corporation beneath the broader Rostec conglomerate, with the explicit ambition of building a genuine competitor to the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320. The original design leaned heavily on international components, most critically a pair of Pratt & Whitney PW1400G engines, alongside Western-sourced composite materials and avionics. The aircraft completed its first flight on May 28, 2017. Almost the exact same month and year, the C919 achieved the same milestone, and for a brief window, it genuinely looked like Russia might pull off something remarkable. Then came the sweeping sanctions triggered by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and everything about the MC-21 program changed overnight. Rostec lost access to its Pratt & Whitney engines, its Western composite materials, and its Western avionics essentially all at once, and rather than abandon the project, Russian leadership committed to rebuilding the entire aircraft from scratch using purely domestic components, an effort officials called import substitution. The centerpiece of that rebuild was the Aviation PD-14, a domestically engineered turbofan built by the Perm Engine Company, replacing the Pratt & Whitney engines the aircraft had originally been designed around entirely. What followed was a genuinely staggering string of broken promises. Serial production, originally targeted for 2016, slipped to 2019, then 2020, then 2022, then 2024. By May 2026, Rostec chief executive Sergei Chemezov was forced to admit certification and initial deliveries were slipping yet again, now pushed to 2027, a full 11 years past the program's original target, with United Aircraft hoping to eventually reach an annual production rate of 36 aircraft by 2030. The gap between the C919 and MC-21's actual current status becomes starkly clear once you compare where each program genuinely sits as of mid-2026. The C919, whatever its production struggles, has been flying real passengers on real commercial routes since May 2023, has accumulated 37 total deliveries, and operates across an expanding domestic route network, having recently begun scheduled flights into Hong Kong. The MC-21, by contrast, had not delivered a single production aircraft to any airline as of mid-2026. In late May into early June of that year, United Aircraft finally moved what it called the first serially built, fully import-substituted MC-21-310 off its Irkutsk assembly line and over to the company's flight test division, a milestone that sounds significant until you realize it simply meant the aircraft could finally begin the certification testing process, not that it was anywhere close to actually carrying a paying passenger. By July 2026, Russia's own aviation regulator, Rosaviatsia, placed the overall certification effort at roughly 45% complete, with Yakovlev's chief designer stating the flight test campaign remained on track to conclude sometime in June 2027, assuming nothing else went wrong along the way. In blunt terms, while the C919 has already crossed the single hardest threshold in commercial aviation, actually achieving full-type certification and beginning revenue passenger service, the MC-21 remains stuck on the wrong side of that exact same line, still working through the certification process, nearly a decade after its original target date for doing so. Both programs, despite that meaningfully different starting point, share a remarkably similar set of underlying obstacles, and understanding those shared weaknesses reveals something genuinely important about just how difficult it actually is to build a globally competitive commercial aircraft from scratch under sustained geopolitical pressure. Both aircraft depend on a single, precarious point of failure in their engine supply chain. The C919 remains tied to CFM's LEAP 1C engines, a dependency that leaves it directly exposed to American export control decisions that can, and already have, temporarily halted deliveries with essentially no warning. The MC-21's domestic PD-14 engine avoids that specific vulnerability, but trades it for an entirely different one, a manufacturing base that simply cannot yet produce engines fast enough to matter, with Perm Engine Company completing only 7 PD-14 engines in all of 2025 against an original target of 24, a shortfall that alone would make any meaningful MC-21 production ramp-up essentially impossible regardless of how quickly certification testing itself proceeds. Both programs have also repeatedly publicly slashed their own delivery targets by wide margins, sometimes by 2/3 or more within a single year, a pattern of chronic overpromising that has eroded outside analyst confidence in either company's own stated production roadmaps. And both programs remain almost entirely dependent on captive, state-directed domestic orders rather than genuine competitive success in the open international market, with the C919's backlog concentrated overwhelmingly among Chinese state airlines, and the MC-21's own confirmed orders sitting almost exclusively with Russia's state-controlled Aeroflot group. Where the two programs diverge most sharply is in the fundamental nature of the industrial base each country brings to the challenge, and this is genuinely where the C919's meaningful head start becomes clear. China's aerospace and broader manufacturing supply chain, even accounting for its heavy reliance on Western engines and avionics for this specific aircraft, sits inside an economy with vastly larger overall industrial capacity, a considerably larger pool of skilled aerospace engineering talent, and, critically, an economy that has not been operating under the same scale of comprehensive wartime sanctions Russia has faced continuously since 2022. Russia's MC-21 program isn't simply struggling with typical aerospace supply chain complexity, the kind every new aircraft program faces to some degree. It is attempting something considerably more radical, rebuilding an entire aircraft's core systems, engines, composites, avionics, hydraulics, essentially from the ground up, using a domestic supplier base that, in some cases, had to develop entire manufacturing capabilities from scratch that China's supply chain, however dependent on Western parts for this specific aircraft, never had to build from nothing in the first place. China chose to depend on Western engines because doing so was commercially efficient and technically advantageous. Russia was forced to abandon Western engines entirely because sanctions left it with no other option. And that forced wartime pivot has proven considerably more costly and considerably slower than China's calculated dependency, even though China's own approach carries its own genuine long-term strategic risk, given how easily Washington has already demonstrated it can disrupt that supply chain when it chooses to. Both nations bring genuinely different historical baggage to this challenge too, and that history shapes how each government and each domestic aviation industry actually approaches the problem of building a competitive aircraft from scratch. The Soviet Union maintained a fully independent commercial aviation industry for decades during the Cold War, producing aircraft like the Tupolev Tu-154 and Ilyushin Il-86 that that serve the entire Eastern Bloc, without depending on a single Western component. An entire generational tradition of self-sufficient aerospace manufacturing that largely collapsed in the economic chaos following the Soviet Union's 1991 dissolution, as Russian airlines increasingly turned to cheaper, more reliable Boeing and Airbus jets throughout the 1990s and 2000s. The MC-21 program represented, in many ways, an attempt to reclaim that lost independence, though ironically its original 2007 design path back toward genuine global competitiveness required leaning more heavily on Western components than any Soviet-era airliner ever had, a strategic choice that made the aircraft credible on the world stage right up until the exact moment 2022 sanctions turned that same Western dependence into an existential vulnerability. China, by contrast, never possessed anything close to a comparable independent commercial aviation tradition to draw on or reclaim. The C919 represents China's first genuine attempt at building a large, internationally credible commercial jetliner from a standing start, without the kind of decades-old domestic aerospace manufacturing base Russia, whatever its current struggles, could at least theoretically draw institutional memory and engineering talent from. That difference cuts in genuinely complicated directions for each program's prospects. Russia has proven engineering knowledge somewhere in its institutional memory, but that knowledge sits scattered across a manufacturing base that atrophied badly during 3 post-Soviet decades. China lacks that historical foundation entirely, but has built its entire modern aerospace effort atop a vastly larger, more modern, and more rapidly expanding industrial base than Russia's own aerospace sector currently possesses. Since neither the C919 nor the MC-21 is actually trying to unseat Boeing and Airbus in any near-term sense. Both manufacturers together produce dozens of narrow-body aircraft every single month, decades of accumulated production experience, globally proven reliability records, and crucially, full certification from every major aviation regulator on Earth, allowing their aircraft to be operated by essentially any airline, anywhere, without restriction. Neither the C919 nor the MC-21 currently holds certification from the American FAA or Europe's EASA, meaning neither aircraft can legally operate for the vast majority of the world's airlines outside their own domestic markets and closest political allies, regardless of how many aircraft either company eventually manages to physically build. That reality caps the realistic near-term ambitions of both programs at essentially the same ceiling, dominating captive domestic and allied markets while remaining functionally locked out of the broader global commercial aviation market that Boeing and Airbus still overwhelmingly control. Both countries' ambitions also extend well beyond these single narrow-body programs, and comparing their respective follow-on efforts offers another useful lens for judging which nation's broader aerospace strategy looks more likely to eventually achieve genuine scale. China's COMAC has already secured an avionics partnership with Aviation Systems, a joint venture between GE Aerospace and China's own Aviation Industry Corporation for its next major program. The C929 widebody, alongside a launch order from Air China, targeting a maiden flight around 2030 and entry into service sometime near 2035. Preliminary design work has reportedly even begun on an even larger, longer-range quad-class aircraft, tentatively referred to as the C939. Positioned to eventually challenge the Boeing 777 and Airbus A350 decades down the road. Russia's own wide-body ambitions, meanwhile, center on the C929's old sibling program, initially a joint venture with China itself before that partnership collapsed following the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, leaving Russia to occasionally float renewed cooperation proposals to India instead, discussions that have so far produced no concrete commitments. That specific detail is worth sitting with for a moment, since it means China's next-generation wide-body ambitions have already secured a real launch customer and a functioning international supplier partnership, while Russia's own comparable long-term ambitions remain stuck at the stage of informal diplomatic outreach to a country that already walked away from a similar aircraft partnership with Russia once before, even accounting for genuine skepticism about whether COMAC's own optimistic C929 and C939 timelines will hold up any better than its C919 targets have. China's aerospace industry is visibly building outward from its narrow-body program toward larger, more ambitious follow-on aircraft in a way Russia's own aerospace sector, still consumed by simply trying to finish certifying the MC-21 itself, has not yet been able to seriously replicate. So, genuinely, which one can actually reach scale? Based on where each program stands right now, the honest answer is that the C919 holds a real, meaningful, if still fragile, lead, precisely because it has already crossed the single hardest threshold. Either aircraft needs to clear, achieving full domestic certification and beginning actual revenue passenger service. a milestone the MC-21 is not expected to reach until 2027 at the absolute earliest, and quite possibly 2028, given the program's own consistent history of missed deadlines. The C919's production ramp genuinely has been disappointing, repeatedly falling dramatically short of its own stated targets, and its almost total dependence on Western engines remains a genuine, unresolved strategic vulnerability that could resurface at any moment if trade tensions between Washington and Beijing escalate again. But disappointing production numbers from an aircraft that is at least flying, certified, and carrying real passengers still represents meaningfully more actual progress than an aircraft that, as of mid-2026, has not yet completed certification testing at all. That said, framing this purely as a two-horse race with a clear winner risks oversimplifying just how much genuine uncertainty still hangs over both programs' longer-term trajectories. If China and the United States enter a renewed period of escalated trade tension and Washington decides to permanently, rather than temporarily, cut off CFM engine supplies to COMAC, the C919's entire production line could grind to a halt almost overnight, regardless of how many airframes sit otherwise complete on the assembly floor waiting for engines that simply never arrive. Conversely, if Russia's PD-14 engine program finally clears its persistent manufacturing bottlenecks, and if the MC-21's remaining certification hurdles prove less stubborn than the program's own recent history suggests, Rostec could theoretically compress years of remaining work into a shorter window than currently seems plausible, particularly if the broader war in Ukraine reaches some kind of resolution that eases pressure on Russia's wider industrial base. Neither scenario is the current baseline expectation, but both remain genuinely possible, and both illustrate just how contingent this entire comparison actually is on factors extending well beyond pure engineering competence, geopolitics, sanctions regimes, and the unpredictable diplomatic relationships between Washington, Beijing, and Moscow that neither aircraft manufacturer actually controls. If the specific question is which program is more likely to eventually achieve genuine industrial scale, tens of aircraft delivered annually, expanding beyond a purely captive domestic market, the C919 simply has more runway behind it, more operational experience already banked, and a considerably larger overall industrial and economic base supporting it, even while both programs share the exact same fundamental vulnerability, remaining almost entirely dependent on their own government's willingness to keep directing captive orders their way rather than genuinely winning business on the open international market against two manufacturers that have spent more than half a century perfecting exactly what both COMAC and Rostec are still, even now, only beginning to learn how to do.